Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am most pleased to welcome you to a rather long series starting with today's program. It's going to be titled Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. As we carry out a several-week series of programs, I want to thank 13 organizations, and 8 of those being colleges and universities, as we've put on this symposium at North Idaho College and Gonzaga University, and we're interviewing our guests while they have been in our cities for this conference. Today we start with Reverend David Ostendorf. He is a United Church of Christ minister, currently serving as director of the Chicago-based Center for New Community. Since 1974, our guest has been engaged in social, economic, and racial justice organizing, and in that capacity has worked closely with the nation's religious and civic communities at all levels. The organization that he heads since organization that has been established since 1995 is committed to building democratic communities for justice and racial equality. Our guest holds a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from Elmhurst College, which he received in 1969, and the honor a Doctor of Divinity in 1987. He also holds a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York in 1972 and a Master of Science from the University of Michigan in 1974, where he was a National Science Foundation Fellow. Reverend Ostendorf, welcome to our program, and we know our topic today is Christian identity, and you're very well informed to deal with this really serious question and issue that we'd classify in the field of hate. With that, I welcome our panel, and first of all, Janelle Burke, who's a regular panelist and attorney in the state of Idaho, and I'm, for the first time, very pleased to welcome to the program as a panelist Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and she has been very instrumental in us putting this whole series together. With that, we'll turn the program over to Janelle Burke.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to talk about a very important subject, and one that a lot of people have heard the name Christian identity, but they may not know exactly what that means. So can you tell us, define for us, the Christian identity movement? What is it about?
Well, Christian identity is basically a theology or an ideology that is really underlays the entire white supremacist movement in this country, has for many years, and was the driving ideology for the Aryan nation here in northern Idaho. It's, in simplest terms, it's an understanding that salvation comes by race and not by grace or any other means, that if you're white, you're saved, as long as you adhere, of course, to those kinds of fundamental racist and anti-Semitic beliefs.
And who belongs to this movement, would you say, in general?
Well, there have been a variety of people who have belonged. Many of the leading people in the racist movement in America over the past 20 years. Richard Butler, of course, was a primary adherent of Christian identity and a proponent and a purveyor of Christian identity all throughout the nation through the Aryan Nation compound, and a variety of other racist leaders here in the country.
Do they generally meet in a church kind of setting? They call it Christian identity. Mm-hmm. Do they meet in a church type setting?
Well, actually, there are quite a few congregations across the country that are essentially small churches, like any other church you might see. And they occasionally do meet in those kinds of settings. They will meet in other places as well, hotels or camps, wherever they can gather people that are not perhaps part of a permanent congregation.
Erna Reinhardt.
Dave, could you give us some examples of how these groups use things out of the Bible to promote their ideology?
Well, sure. For example, they believe that Adam was created by God as a white man, and that only people who are white are people of God. They believe that people of color are subhuman. They sometimes say pre-Adamic. They were created before Adam. They sometimes say that they're mud people, with the racist connotation being very clear, and so on. So that's one thing. They also believe that Jews are the children of the devil, that Jews are literally the offspring of Eve and the serpent, and thereby basically less than human as well.
And how does this whole movement, how is it manifested today? I know that you spoke a little bit about the Christian identity movement and then how that has evolved into the militia movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Christian identity was, in fact, the ideological framework that spawned the militia movement in 1992 out of a meeting in Estes Park that was organized by Pete Peters, who's one of the leading identity pastors in this country out of LaPorte, Colorado. And it's been manifested in numerous different ways over the past 20 to 30 years. Obviously, the Aryan Nation compound was one of those manifestations, but there are settlements and compounds across the country that have been born out of this movement. Southwest Missouri, there's a major kind of Christian identity congregation down there with many people in a several county area. So they're spread quite a ways across the entire nation, actually.
It's very complex dealing with a movement like this, and certainly there is no question that one can label it, as you're an expert, as a hate group movement or hate organization. And theology, you can call it that, really. It's not, I wouldn't really want to think it as a theology, but when members of the Christian identity movement have been challenged with such things as claiming they are Christian and they're so anti-Semitic and that they deny that Jesus Christ was a Jew as in the terms of the Jewish community today, it's my understanding that in their misuse of history and misquoting of history, where they talk about the dividing of the land in Israel between the north and the south, and the 12 tribes of the north are the ones that they went north. So would you, this is my little introduction, would you explain that concept and how they tried to claim that Jesus Christ was an Aryan? And my second part is a very complicated and involved question, but the second part is that all Christian identity people don't use exactly the same explanation as they go through the process, do they?
Right, that's correct, Tony. The foundational belief is that the 10 lost tribes of Israel, the northern tribes, left the Mideast, emigrated up through Europe, and eventually landed in Great Britain. And that was sort of the foundational belief for what became known as British Israelism, which was the precursor, if you will, to Christian identity in this country. And then when that belief system, British Israelism, came to the United States, then it was kind of transformed, and the understanding was that white American Christians were, in fact, the lost, the inheritors of all the promises that God gave to the tribes of Israel. So that's kind of the short version of how they see white American Christians as being the inheritors of the promise. And indeed, not all Christian identity people believe sort of the same variations of the movement of the people of Israel. They don't all necessarily believe the same things about the fact that the Jews are seeds of the devil, etc. But the bottom line is, regardless of where they may come into their own differences, the bottom line is that they believe that, again, salvation is by race. And that's just as simply put as we can get it.
And with their vile philosophy that's so anti-Semitic, do they not claim that as this break took place and the 10 tribes went north, that the southern part was and is identified as the Jewish community today?
Right. The remaining tribes in the south were then the Jews, and they are no longer the inheritors of God's promises, basically. And with regard to Jesus, I mean, their Christology, their understandings of Christ are, as you suggested, that Jesus was an Aryan, that Jesus, in fact, some proponents say that Jesus spent his youth in Great Britain with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea in tin mines up there and so on, to, again, verify that Jesus was an Aryan and not a Jew, as it were.
When they rewrite history, revisionists and all, some of these same groups even claim the Holocaust didn't happen too, when we have thousands and thousands of soldiers that documented that at the end of World War II. So facts don't get in their way.
Right. That's exactly right.
Janelle Berg.
My next question has to do with membership and how they gain their membership. How do they manage to convince people to become members of the Christian identity movement?
Well, I think a lot of people go to Christian identity gatherings and congregations just like they do to perhaps other religious gatherings, looking for a community, looking for answers, looking for a place where they can profess their faith and so on. I think that some people don't necessarily go there to get, kind of the racist and anti-Semitic underpinnings of the movement, but once they're there, they pick up on that. But they also have been able to attract quite a few people over the years who may be disaffected for one reason or another. A lot of people who don't want to live in a multiracial or multicultural society, who believe that white people need to stay together, and basically they attract those people to their movement.
What kinds of institutions do they use in order to, and I'm using the word institutions broadly, do they use to attract those members? Do they use things like the internet? Do they use things like the written word? Do they have mailing lists? How do they?
They are very,
get
very
members?
good at doing tape ministries and pamphlet and written ministries. Very prolific at all of those medium. There's certainly some use of the internet, but I would say that the internet is not that basic a tool that they use these days. It's word of mouth. There's a newspaper called the Jubilee that comes out monthly. It's not necessarily totally Christian Identity, but it's one of those monthly publications that kind of holds the movement together in some respects too. And they're like any other group or movement or networks through a variety of different channels and relationships.
Tim, I understand there's something new happening in our country with what's called white power music. And I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about that, and then what we as parents can do, or what we as communities can do to expose that.
Well, white power music is a relatively new phenomenon. It started in Europe in basically what's known as a fascist movement over there, the Nazi or neo-Nazi movement some years back. And again, like Identity, came across the Atlantic in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a cultural phenomenon among a lot of alienated skinhead youth, and took root in this country in a variety of different ways and places among a lot of different bands. And it really it became consolidated about the mid-90s in something called Resistance Records, and this was a group that really kind of began to pull a lot of the bands together, a lot of the labels together. And then in the late 90s, William Pierce, who was head of the National Alliance, the largest neo-Nazi organization in America, bought Resistance Records. Pierce is a very smart man, PhD physics. He's built an organization that's been very powerful. And Pierce saw white power music as being the primary way to recruit new youth to an aging movement, and it has been a very effective way. As one of the leaders of one of these bands once said, he could give a kid a brochure and he'd read it once and throw it away. Give him music and he'd hear the music 20 times, and by the 20th time he heard the words and got the words down. So it's been a cultural phenomenon that's been very effective in recruiting youth, and I think parents need to be aware of that. Kids need to be aware of it. We're organizing with youth, doing a lot of peer organizing with youth. That's where the most important work has to take place, because it's like all of us, we're probably told by our parents, you shouldn't be listening to that music or whatever, and don't particularly like adults telling us that. So we do a lot of peer youth organizing to help kids work with their friends and their neighbors to stop this kind of proliferation of white power music.
William Pierce died some months ago, I believe it's last year, and his organization has been split since then. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a great research organization, has indicated that there is that split going on. Someone who's also studying this whole process, what do you think is, will the organization fall apart, or will it break into factions? Or?
I don't think so. Of course, one never knows, but I think, as is the case with any organization where a primary leader is out of the scene, there's jockeying for power, and some people kind of are shifted out of power and so on. So that kind of continues to go on. But in spite of that, they've still maintained their presence and their organizational structure across the country. They're in numerous cities all across the nation. I mean, from Seattle to Salt Lake City to Chicago to, all along the East Coast. And while they may be comparatively small, they're still very vocal, very committed, and a very powerful organization in the sense that they continue to purvey that kind of racist attitude and understanding of the world. And also they're becoming a little bit more mainstream too. They like to wear shirts and ties instead of brown shirts.
A new strategy. On the specifics of the Christian identity again, there are Christian identity people in the hate movement, and then there are other people in the hate movement that are not part of the Christian identity, but they also work together. Right. What does your research indicate that, like when they have conferences, or in the case when the Aryan nations, which have been defeated in the courts and has no headquarters anymore, but when they were having their congresses, that certainly the Christian identity was a very basic part of that, but there were others who would come to that were absolutely atheist and all. Right. How do they get all that together in relation to their philosophy when a number of the people working in their congresses now do not believe in their own doctrine?
Well, I think, again, they're bound by their racism as much as anything, and their anti-Semitism, so that even though they may differ ideologically on a few points, they do gather. I mean, the meeting held in Estes Park, Colorado in 1992, where roughly 150 of the country's leading white supremacists gathered. They sort of put aside all their differences, came together at that meeting, and essentially developed the foundation for what became the militia movement. So they will put aside some of those differences when it's necessary to coalesce the movement, and they are networked just like any other social movement across the country, and in spite of the differences, they'll come together when they have to.
You know, when you're dealing with such doctrines and ideas, don't ever look for rationality, and you look for irrationality and contradiction. One of the things that the Christian identity movement has said of some members is that the white race that they call the Christian race is light skin, and therefore they can blush and they can show embarrassment and conscience, and those who are of color cannot do so. How would they explain in that irrational doctrine, how would they explain Jewish people who could also blush?
Well, they don't believe that Jewish people are white. Again, they are the children of the devil, and not from direct lineage of Adam, the white man created by God. So,
but it does contradict some of their comments about visuals and specifics.
Right, it does. So that's one of the nuances that you have to traverse in order to understand, how they make that separation. But that's right. They don't believe Jewish people are white.
Janelle Burke.
I want to ask a question regarding violence in the movement. In general, Christian churches believe in peaceful approach to problem solving, and my understanding is that that's not necessarily true with the Christian identity movement.
Well, the movement has, of course, been infused with a fierce anti-government attitude and a hatred of government for many years. I mean, they believe basically the government of this country, for example, is controlled by the Jews. Therefore, the term Zionist occupational government, there, ZOG, ZOG, as you sometimes see it. And so that hatred of government is, again, another step in the hatred of Jews. William Potter Gale, for example, espoused the need to, as necessary, take on the government in violent ways as necessary. They also believe that in this sort of millennial period that the trials and tribulations are necessary before Christ comes again, so that sometimes it's necessary to foment that kind of violence in order to bring about the return of Christ. So, those are other pieces of rationale from some identity proponents that kind of move them toward violence as necessary. But my own sense is, and again, maybe not all of us would agree on this, but my own sense is it's much more the sort of anti-government, anti-Jewish drive that has really fomented the kind of violence we've seen over the years from the identity movement.
Marla Reinhardt.
Some communities, Dave, have been very successful in eradicating these individuals and encouraging them to go elsewhere, I guess, or being more vocal about standing up for human rights. What would you say communities could do to make those kinds of things happen?
Well, we just feel it's imperative for communities to address this reality as soon, as quickly as possible when it appears. And sometimes communities kind of get caught off guard. I mean, that's just a reality. But, for example, when we get word from a community, someone calls our office and says, look, we understand there's going to be an identity meeting in town or a camp next week, or Memorial Day weekend as they will gather in Branson, Missouri. we basically try to work with them immediately to both expose the organization and the individuals, to really work with the religious, labor, business community, whoever we can get to the table, to help them understand the breadth and depth of this problem, and to speak out publicly and vocally against it, and basically, if possible, to really stop the gathering. Again, it's they have a right to gather too, but they don't necessarily have the right to gather in any place they choose. So it's just imperative that communities do respond as quickly and as effectively as possible. Otherwise, it creates a space and opportunity for these groups to grow, because what they'll do is they'll come to town, and even though it may be a relatively small group, they may attract 2 or 3 new followers. And then you've got a sort of a growing core group, and then they start attracting some more followers. And then, you end up with a real problem in your backyard. And it also, I've always said that when it comes right down to it, the color of hate is often green. That is money, and it can have a real financial impact on the community, as I think some Idaho communities have experienced in the past years. Same things happen in Topeka, Kansas, for example, where there's been a real problem down there for many years, and the business community is really what helped organize in Topeka, because it was having such an economic impact on that city.
You had an organization. As I introduced it, you're the director of the Chicago-based Center for New Community. And I want to do 2 things. First of all, our program goes into 7 states and into parts of Canada. And if in the future someone would like to get in touch with your organization or expertise on this very thing about how communities respond, we didn't tell our staff, but is there some way that we could share it today with our viewers where they might reach you? Well,
certainly. They obviously, probably the easiest way to do it is by phone, and
we can give them a phone number.
We can give them that phone number. It's 708-848-0319. 708-848-0319. You can go to our website at www.newcom.org.
I believe you pressed that a little slower this time.
Yes. newcom.org.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Because we always want to be helpful to our viewers.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And tell us a little more about your organization. I introduced it as it certainly is an organization that engages in social, economic, and racial justice organizing. Just give us kind of a mission statement of what you do.
Well, our intent is to help build democratic communities for justice and racial equality. That's our mission statement, and that takes place in a number of different ways. We do community organizing in a variety of different sites across the country, mostly in rural areas and small cities. We do a lot of this work to counter the white supremacist movement, the white nationalist movement in the country, to help communities deal with that. And then we have a new program where we'll be working with rural pastors across the whole central part of the country, from the Great Lakes to the Rockies, training rural pastors for ministry in the 21st century. So those are our 3 primary program areas, and we have deployed staff across the Midwest as well as our base staff in Chicago.
My next question is probably a biased one, in the sense that we're very proud of our community here. 22 years ago, we created a local organization that's been work all this time, and actually this organization was contacted by the Keenans, and our attorney, who in turn got Morris Dees in here, and the great victory in the court. But when you go in and you do training, or you do regional training of ministers and others, is it your advocacy that you can only stay so long, you leave, you train and leave? Should every community have an ongoing organization that can respond to hate?
Oh, I believe so. Absolutely. It's critical. And I think the work that so many folks out here in the Northwest have done over these past 20 years has been absolutely critical to the eventual defeat of the Aryan Nation, and to the advance of human and civil rights across the region. And I hope that the work you've done here, I hope the work that's going on in other communities across the region will continue to grow and deepen and expand, because it's the only way that we're going to be able to put up that kind of a concerted effort in the front to counter this. Just because the Aryan Nation compound is kind of gone, as it were, doesn't mean that white supremacy and this kind of hatred and racism is gone, as we all well know. So I think the challenge before all of us is to constantly respond to this movement as it takes different shapes and forms, and as it manifests itself in different ways. And we always have to be very vigilant and conscious and aware and about those changes, and always be ready to create new responses to it. And and constantly to build relationships among all people, so that we've got a strong foundation in our communities and our counties, so that there's no space, there's no vacuum for this kind of racism and hatred to take root and take base.
Thank you, Janelle Burke.
Erna asked a very good question a few minutes ago about communities and what a community should do if they sense that they have a problem. I want to follow up on that and ask, what can individuals do if they sense that there's a problem with someone that they know? What kinds of things can they do to avoid a friend or a neighbor from getting into the kinds of problems that might occur if they get associated with a hate movement?
Right. Well, I think that getting in contact with a local organization, local human rights, civil rights organization is essential. I mean, sometimes we just don't have, many of us just don't have that information and knowledge about some of these groups or individuals, and so getting in contact with your local organization or with a national organization, perhaps sometimes can put you back in touch with the local group, is essential. And I think that for an individual to gain as much understanding and awareness as possible about the organization, so that they perhaps can have a one-to-one relationship and discussion with that individual, and perhaps dissuade them from becoming part of the movement. I think those are the key things that individuals need to be about.
So you're indicating that step number one is knowing about the doctrine.
Right.
Because some people have been deceived about what it really... The term does not tell you what it's really about.
No, that's exactly right. Exactly right.
On that note, I'm going to bring our program to conclusion. First of all, I want to say to Erna Reinhardt, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you on this series as we go through, and Janelle always for her fine contributions, and Reverend David Orsendorf, thank you so much on dealing with Christian identity. You've been extremely informative, and we appreciate it very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting this week a rather long series on confronting hate, humanity's greatest challenge. And at the end of the program today, you will see a list of those organizations and universities and colleges across Inland Northwest, and also the Carr Center at the John Kennedy School at Harvard that are co-sponsors of this symposium we've been putting on. And we're going to bring you a number of experts from across America in the weeks ahead dealing with how do you address confronting hate. And I hope you will be with us for this entire series that's going to be for a number of weeks that lies ahead. Until then, I wish all of you a good week, and please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.